As global competition accelerates and space becomes an increasingly contested warfighting domain, the U.S. Space Force is transforming how the nation protects, operates, and prevails in space. From building resilient satellite architectures and advancing space domain awareness to integrating digital systems and autonomous capabilities, the service is redefining how space power enables joint and coalition operations. To discuss how combat credible space forces are organized, trained, and employed, I'm pleased to welcome Lieutenant General Greg Gagnon, Commander of Combat Forces Command. General, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Tom, good to see you again. And we just met a couple weeks ago when you were out in Colorado at the AFA Warfighting Symposium, and we had world-class weather then. It was sunny, it was warm. Well, it's still sunny here today, but you in DC, you came in during some snow, and I appreciate that for the follow-through.
Absolutely. Send some of that weather our way, please. I don't know.
We will snow back here, I'm not going to lie.
Thank you for joining us. Before we jump into some current events, I'd like to go back in time. I kind of want to wind back the clock to when you were a young second lieutenant starting out. What was your knowledge of space operations then? How does it compare to how you view the domain now? And did you really ever believe that there would be a Space Force, let alone that you'd be playing a major role in it?
I would tell you, if I rolled back that clock to second lieutenant time, you would find a young Greg Gagnon serving in Korea in the United States Air Force. And my job there was to be a targeteer. So my job at that time frame with F-16s at Kunsan Air Base was to weaponeer the actual munition that went on the aircraft that would have the desired effect against the intended target. So in that, we would figure out, does it need to be a 500-pound bomb or does it need to be a 1,000-pound bomb? Do you need to change the timing on the fusing so that you could get further into the bunker before it exploded? That type of application of combat power started for me at the beginning of my career. Did I think there would be a Space Force in 1995 when I was second lieutenant serving overseas? I'd have to say no. I would have to say no. I've never been a sci-fi guy. I've never been like a futuristic thinking guy. I'm more of a meat and potatoes watching sports guy. And I would tell you, I wouldn't have thought that 30 years later, I wouldn't be in the United States Air Force anymore. I'd be in the United States Space Force. And I honestly, if we were being 100% honest, if you asked me, Second Lieutenant Greg Gagnon, what I'd be doing in 6 years, I would be an investment banker, an international investment banker. I wouldn't even be serving in the military. So my 30-year career is really a series of 4-year decision points, first with myself and then with my wife and I. And it's just amazing that it's run this long.
Well, truly, it's an impressive resume. Looking at your bio, so much of your background was as a career intelligence officer. You've held key intel roles at the National Security Agency, Air Combat Command, U.S. Space Command. And with that experience, I'm curious how that has made you view the Space Force's relationship within the intel community, but also how it's informed the way you view the Space Force's operations, because so many people come into the Space Force either from an acquisitions background or maybe from a missileer background. And so given that intel background, I'm curious, how that has colored your view of things.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And what that really gets to is, why do we have a service, a military service specifically focused on space? And for that, Tom, I would ask you, why do we have military services and why are they specifically focused? So we have a United States Air Force because we need to deliver for the joint force, both the Marines, the Navy, and the Army. We need to deliver the ability to control the air, because controlling the air allows our forces that are on the surface, both the maritime and the ground forces, not to have weapons employed on them by adversary aircraft. Why do we have a United States Navy? Well, we've had a United States Navy for a very long time. It's been to control the sea lanes. right, to enable U.S. access around the globe for both commerce and national security purposes. So they call that sea control. The Air Force calls air control air superiority. Why do we have a specially focused Marine Corps? We have a specially focused Marine Corps that builds proficiency using air, maritime, and surface forces to seize the littoral ground, because it's difficult to do landing operations like you probably saw in Saving Private Ryan, right? That's a specialized skill. And why do we have a ground force? To take and hold terrain. So each service has a top priority mission assigned to them, and it's to be the best at what they do in their domain. Today, and honestly 10 years ago, we saw a shift where space went from a peaceful environment to a contested environment, not because we wanted it to, but because our adversaries had made it so. We properly forecasted with intelligence that both the Chinese military and the Russian military wanted to seize control of outer space, to use it as the ultimate high ground in warfighting. And in order to build the forces needed with the expertise needed to contest that, challenge that, and ensure that freedom-loving countries still have the access to space they need and the use of space they need, we needed to create a Space Force. And our priority mission in the Space Force is space control. It is to be able to use outer space at the time and place of our choosing for the purposes we need. When we were inside the United States Air Force, there wasn't enough focus going to that mission, nor enough resources. So the national leadership, to include on the Hill in Congress, said, hey, now is the time that we need to stand up the United States Space Force. That was 2019. I will tell you, we weren't the first country to think through that. Both Russia and China reorganized their militaries in August and December of 2015. And they created specialized, focused space forces to help accelerate their advancements in outer space. Since we've stood up the United States Space Force, you've also seen military reorganizations inside the German Armed Forces, UK forces, Australian forces, French forces, and Italian forces. So the trend is certainly going to where people need specialized military expertise in order to ensure they have the use of space. Once you have space control, or once you have the ability to use space for your purposes, then you can allow your intel agencies to operate their satellites and have protected satellites so that they can do the things that they do great for the nation, which is learn what enemy forces are thinking of doing and what enemy forces are able to do. But the first necessary condition in that whole equation is you need to have freedom to use space and freedom to deny that use of space for an adversary, if so directed. That's why you have a Space Force.
I think that's a really important primer, and I think really ties us into some current events. So speaking of operations, we are in the middle of an ongoing war with Iran, and we're starting to hear top officials discuss the role that the Space Force is playing in that mission. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper made a brief mention of that in a recent video, saying that Guardians are degrading Iranian capability. They're helping protect American forces. General Dan Kane, he described Space and Cyber Command as those first movers who coordinated those operations effectively to disrupt comms, sensor networks across the AOR. And they were, his quote there of leaving the adversary without the ability to see, coordinate, or respond effectively. Now, I know we can't get into operational details, but I'm hoping you can discuss a little bit about what it's like to generate, present, and sustain Guardians for operations like that. What it's like preparing those forces for the fight.
I think it's awesome that you just asked that question that way, because we're in a video and this won't show up in the transcript, but here was me taking my notes on Admiral Cooper and General Kane in the exact quote. So you and I are reading the same thing. But let's talk about what has to happen before the employment of the forces, right? How do they get to be so proficient and so combat effective, not just inside their own service with their teammates, but but across their services with other specialties, whether they be aviators or they be surface warfare officers. In order to develop that type of proficiency, it is absolutely essential that you focus on being ready for the future fight. Whether that future fight takes place in CENTCOM or that potential future fight takes place somewhere else against another adversary that may have a space force 3 times larger than your own, right? When you have to go down a dark alley and you're outnumbered 3-1, you better make sure that your kung fu is solid, right? So in that, we are training space forces to continue to integrate into the joint force with layered space and cyber effects in order to make sure that if my airman is outnumbered, he's the most effective airman in the world. If my sailor is outnumbered or they're close to many, coastal cruise missiles and such, that they are the most survivable they can be, right? That actually takes training. That takes training of the individual who knows how to use their particular rifle, if you will. Our rifles in the Space Force tend to have keyboards because we're doing remote operations with satellites and other capabilities. But first, they must learn their job. Then they must learn to be part of a crew, which is a number of individuals. Some of our crews are as small as 7 people. Some of our crews are as large as 120 people. So first individual proficiency, then crew proficiency. Then I would tell you that many of the things we do in the United States Space Force are not executed by a single squadron, which is our fundamental unit of action. It's executed by a number of squadrons working together. So then they have to learn how that crew from one squadron works with the crew from another squadron and how they can sequence their activities to be most effective against an adversary who will make decisions to try to make them unsuccessful. Once they have finished the 300 level of military operations, we got to take it to a 400 level course where we take our space operators and we put them with airmen and we put them with sailors and we say, how do these space effects best integrate with your schema maneuvers and your fire sequencing in order to be effective? It takes time to build that level of proficiency. It also takes resources. In order to train those, to do those what I call large force employment skills, you need to first have a group of people who are learning their individual skills. You then have to have a group of people who have already learned those individual skills, right, and are now employing as part of a crew. And then you need to have forces that are crew certified, because we do operations every day, 24/7. But I also need a second crew that can do the training event that I need for that crew to work with those other squadrons. And then finally, I need a third iteration that is that crew to work with the larger joint force. That type of capacity currently is a challenge for the United States Space Force because we're so small. You know, the United States Navy has 11 aircraft carriers, right? They generate like 3 of them. That same kind of math formula is the same thing that applies to the United States Space Forces, as we need to grow the size of the operation force so that we can do our job every day and then train for the war that hasn't yet come. And in order to be proficient, we need trainers in each of the squadron. We need live, virtual, and constructed ranges with our partners inside the Space Force, which are known as STARCOM, where they will build out that so we can train. Because I honestly want to train those large force employment activities in a way that the adversary can't see it, because I don't want them to know what those kung fu moves are. Because if they do, they'll build countermeasures to those kung fu moves. That was a long answer to your question, but we get there because we train, and then we train with our partners. And sometimes we even go as far as rehearsing. And in that methodology becomes sort of the level of military expertise that America has become accustomed to seeing from its United States military.
Mm-hmm. It's clear that the Space Force, like you explained, the structure there of what it's like to train and integrate those forces together. I want to kind of do the opposite side of that. So recently, CENTCOM announced that the U.S. military had eliminated what was essentially Iran's version of U.S. Space Command. Now, speaking with experts, it's clear that Iran was not a significant space threat, only had a few IRGC satellites at a much different level of training, of course, than the U.S. Space Force is, the U.S. Space Command is. That being the case, what in your view is the big takeaway for the Space Force, its allies, and even its adversaries following the destruction of Iran's Space Command?
Okay. I would tell you that it goes back to what we talked about last month up in Denver. The primacy of the high ground. Owning the high ground in conflict unlocks the capabilities of all those other domains and all those other services. In the past, the air used to be the high ground. Against adversaries that have large space forces, the air is no longer the ceiling. The space is the ceiling and the high ground. And you must be able to seize and exploit that high ground to unlock the long-range precision and lethality of air forces. In this particular campaign, you are correct. We are not going against a peer space force by any stretch of the imagination. But I will share with you a couple things that should be concerning. The PLA's space force is 3 times larger than your space force. Now, we have more effective people and more effective kit, but 3 to 1 is still not a great number to be rolling in on. So that, as a kind of point and a lesson, is why we need to move forward to the Space Force we need. A Space Force that protects, defends, and as part of the joint force, also has the ability to negate and erode an adversary's use of space so that we keep our sailors and our airmen successful in their terrestrial missions and in the larger military campaign. One of my concerns, Tom, is that the last 2 operations that we've executed, the current one that's under execution, Epic Fury, but also Absolute Resolve, people forget that control of the high ground is important, and they take it for granted. And against all adversary sets in all scenarios, it honestly cannot be taken for granted, because that will lead to mission failure. Inside the Department of War, there is a strong understanding of this. On Capitol Hill, there is a great appreciation for this. Inside the U.S. public, there's very little awareness of this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'm glad you brought up Absolute Resolve. It's been a busy year, obviously. I mean, the Space Force also played a key role in Midnight Hammer. And we're talking about tracking missiles, providing satellite communications to transmit position, timing, and navigation data, using other space-based capabilities to support the joint force. And it seems like that support has, like you said, been well recognized by the department. And I'm curious, too, just how the department is addressing current threats in space. Obviously, the Space Force is keeping that front of mind. I'm curious how the larger department is considering that. And I think it's becoming more clear, like you said at the top of our conversation, that space is becoming a more contested domain. So I think of a significant flashpoint for space warfare is the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite missile test. Created the largest field of space debris in history. And I think it was very clear to the public at that moment that space was a different type of environment than they had thought about before. Take us back to that moment. What was your reaction at that time? And, what has the Space Force and maybe the military at large learned about the threats in space following that?
Okay. If I could unpack that a little bit with the start of our interview. So I told you, I think it was 1995, I was a 2nd lieutenant in Korea. And I was doing a targeting and weaponeering function as a Air Force intelligence officer for the F-16s. Well, when I think it was January 2007, when they did that direct ascent attack against a satellite from the PLA, I was in Asia again, and this time I was at Osan Air Base, and I was a major and I was an ops officer for a large squadron. That large squadron was responsible for informing the 7th Air Force commander, who was the senior airman in South Korea and responsible for the air defense of South Korea. So he was also what was called the Area Air Defense Commander. So obviously missile launches were of significant concern to the senior intel duty officer that would be on shift. That was me. That was my role and my function for that squadron. But that was really that January kind of 2007 was really like the 10th month of change in Asia. Okay, the 10th month of change in Asia. It started in July. It started in July 2006 when the North Koreans launched a Taepodong missile, as well as 6 other missiles. It was the first of the North Korean missile paloozas that we then started to use that term over and over again. And it was very concerning to U.S. forces in the regions, but also to the national intelligence community. And it was difficult to understand what was going on in North Korea at the time. In October of that year, 2006, North Korea detonated a nuclear weapon at Punggye for the first time. The first time. And I highlight that for you because those 2 events, right, started to change the strategic importance of Northeast Asia. Then 4 months after that nuclear weapon detonation at Punggye, you see the Chinese military destroy a satellite in outer space. And at that point, for someone who kind of tracks foreign policy, you start to see what was commonly recognized as a shift to Asia of world economic value to also a shift to Asia about national security concerns. Because those national security concerns in the 2006-2007 timeframe had actually hit a knee in the curve, where the approaches of adversaries of using long-range missiles and using outer space for strategic gain could now impact the U.S. public and the U.S. homeland in a development cycle that would take 10, 15, 20 years, right? So you see a pivot. And since that time, you've seen a pivot in our national security policy documents about the importance of Asia. 2007, in that first destruction of what I think was a defunct weather satellite for the Chinese, was them testing equipment on a decision path that they had made. And that decision path was, look at how powerful the American military is by using outer space. And you said space has now become a contested domain. I think that's so 2020. In 2026, space is a warfighting domain, not because the American military wants to make it so, but because Beijing and Moscow have made it so. They have made a conscious decision to build forces, build doctrine, and build weapons to extend war into space. We really don't have a choice. We can either meet it with defenses and all domain operations, or we can be put at significant disadvantage. And as you know, the Department of War does not plan to be at significant disadvantage, because that would be foolish.
No, it's another good primer. And I see your point there about, the distinction between contested and warfighting domain there too. I want to talk about, prior to your current role, you served as the special assistant to the CSO. So you worked with, General Chance Saltzman. I'm curious what you learned from him about the space domain in that role. And additionally, he's been teasing the release of 2 documents for a while now: the Future Operating Environment, which is looking at those forthcoming threats and trends the service is seeing, and then the Objective Force, which is looking at the systems, units, infrastructure, personnel needed to achieve space superiority by 2040. Now, I don't want to get ahead of those documents. I know he's been briefing folks on them. I know you talked about how the Space Force needs to increase its size, but I'm curious if there's any other specifics about the threat environment or the Space Force's current structure that you think need to change in relation to those documents.
Yeah, I will share with you that, like, you're looking at Wikipedia and the bios that are out there. So General Saltzman is my supervisor today. In that special assistant role, he was my supervisor in that role. And then when I was the deputy chief of space operations for intelligence, he was my boss in that role too. So those really 4 years now, 3 to 4 years now, where we have worked very closely together, has definitely helped inform how I view space. He is a career missile and space officer, much like his predecessor, just General J. Raymond, who was also a missile and space officer. And I think the benefit of having different backgrounds has allowed for a more fruitful dialogue. Obviously, my expertise comes in understanding the adversary. My expertise also comes from sort of a targeting background of growing up in the Air Force and working that, whether it's at a munitions level or a target system analysis level. But we often have discussions and debates, and he makes time for that with his senior staff. So we could have what we would call a skull session in the old days. So we could talk about what we think the war will look like if it comes, and what we would need to be successful in that war. Those discussions are what are informing his CSO notes, which I know you guys have seen both in the media because they're online, but sort of his idea about what it takes to be a successful Space Force, both today, but also in the future. One of his key contributions to the narrative was his theory of competitive endurance. He had three principles inside that competitive endurance theory, the first of which I was very much responsible for executing in my previous jobs, and that was to avoid operational surprise, right? Know what the adversary seeks to do in and through space so that we can counter it. And not just know what they seek to do next week or next month, but what they seek to do in 5 years and in 10 years. And if we can gain penetrating insights into where the adversary thinks they will go in 5 to 10 years with capabilities, organization, and doctrine, then we have the necessary lead time to build countermeasures. And the key thing he did for the service in competitive endurance is he focused the senior leadership team about not thinking about next week. And he got the leadership team to think about the possible next war, which could have been 5 or it could be 10 years away. And how do we stretch that period of peace best? By building a Space Force that clearly deters the adversary from taking action and hopefully denies their first mover advantage, but also builds a Space Force that if that adversary makes the wrong decision and challenges the U.S., that we're a Space Force that can be in the fight, throughout the fight, delivering space superiority and delivering space effects into our joint partners, into the Marines, into the Navy, and into the Air Force, so that their long-range precision and their rapid mobility is enhanced with survivability. Those are the things, sort of leading the intellectual thought and leading it in a way that dragged out the timeline enough that we could effectively work resources inside the Pentagon and concepts inside the force. That's really been what I've taken most from kind of learning from my boss.
Absolutely. I think, you mentioned this as well when talking about the size of the PLA's space forces. But one such change that, the objective force is supposed to analyze is that push that we've seen from service officials in recent months about doubling the size of the service. Right now it sits around 10,000 Guardians. There's a push to make it roughly 20,000. So I'm curious too, from your viewpoint and from the role you sit in, the push for 20,000 Guardians, it's clearly not a recruiting issue. The Space Force has had no problem bringing in that amount of people. I'm curious, is it strictly necessary from trying to match the adversary's manpower perspective? And also, what needs to grow as well, when you bring in those new Guardians? I mean, is it the mission sets have to grow? I'm curious, what has to grow in tandem with that? It's not, I'm assuming, growth for the sake of growth.
No, it absolutely isn't. Let me give you four areas that need to grow. So to put some fidelity on those growth numbers. First off, it's certainly not growth for growth's sake. And it's not us walking away from automation, because we have highly machine-assisted automated actions inside our Space Force today. We have significant return on investment for one use of human capital. What we need to be successful in the future is a more robust and diverse magazine and arsenal of capabilities. And in that diversity and depth of assets requires additional crews. So from an operational perspective, in order to build the Space Force fleet, you need additional crews and sailors on those ships. So that is part of that number. The second part of that number is in our Training and Readiness Command. Inside our Training and Readiness Command, we actually need the squadrons that run our virtual and constructed and live training ranges. We actually need the assessors that evaluate my crews when they're working in those scenarios and in those exercises and give them grades and tell them what they did wrong and debrief them to be better. We also need in StarCom the professional military operational testers that test our equipment in controlled environments so that we have effective weaponeering tables for us to use when we're planning operations. That's just the second bucket. The third bucket is we probably need more acquirers because we think we're going to gain more total obligation authority and resources. So we want our program officers to be postured for success, because when they're postured for success, it leads to better outcomes for the operational force. And let me tell you the fourth bucket that I think we need some help in. We need to have enough capacity in Guardians so that we can put Guardians inside Army formations if they want them to help do liaison functions. We can put Guardians inside Naval headquarters if they want them so that we can coordinate actions with the Navy. That is lacking today. The first thing we have done is build our components inside the Unified Combatant Command Plan. And you've seen the establishment of a senior Guardian as the commander of Space Forces in Indo-PACOM. It's General De Niro. For CENTCOM, that's General Benson. For EUCOM, that's General Middleton. And there's 7 of the 11 senior Guardians in combatant commands now established. We still have 4 headquarters to establish. Those headquarters are nowhere near full strength. So we have a function that we need to coordinate across the joint force that we just don't have the capacity to get to today. There are way more requests for Guardians to work in either the NRO or the Indo-PACOM staff or the joint staff, and we can't say yes to all of them because if we did today, we'd have nobody on crew. So we have a serious demand signal that really needs to be met. Those are the 4 buckets that I see in that at least doubling in size of manpower requirements. We are large, if you zoom all the way out, we're 0.5% of the uniformed people in the Department of Defense. We're about 2 to 3%, I think, of total obligation authority and cost. We're generally viewed by the other services and by OSW as a huge return on investment for the entire joint force. And as you properly highlighted earlier, we do not have a recruiting problem. For every 1 opening we have over 2 people wanting to come in. And that's fantastic. And I'll tell you, for the officer corps, that's people who have already been accepted into the Air Force, like either at the academy or at ROTC. So we're getting a second bite at an apple that is already incredibly selective. So we are getting high quality young Americans.
I think to your point there, you brought up 2 topics, the officer corps, and then also that relationship with acquisitions. One topic that we've unpacked here at Defense One is the breakdown of the Space Forces Officer Corps. In the most recent NDAA, Congress required that the service equal out its acquisitions and operations career fields. There was some fears from lawmakers that it skewed the amount towards operations over acquisitions. From your perspective, I'm curious if we can kind of explain that relationship about how operations informs acquisitions, how acquisitions informs operations, and what you see, if anything needs to be done to balance the 2 career fields in some way, especially if you're talking about expanding the force a significant amount. I'm curious how those 2 career fields play out.
Yeah, I would say inside the Space Force today, there are 5 officer career fields, not 2. Okay. 2 of them, one is engineering, space engineering and space acquisition. Sorry, that's 2 of them. And then the other 3 are cyberspace intelligence, right, and operations. Inside that clumping, I will use some macro numbers, okay? 40% of the officer corps are those first two, space engineering and acquisition. 40% of them are space operators, and about 20% of them are cyberspace and intelligence operators. One of the things we seek to do is we seek to commonize them as lieutenants and give them a core set of experiences, both educational and experiential. And what we have begun to do is, and we've been running it for over a year now, is our officer training course. So every new second lieutenant in the Space Force comes to school here at Peterson Air Force Base, regardless of what specialty they will eventually mature into. They go to course for a year. The course teaches them space, cyber, intel, and gives them initial exposure, about a little over 2 weeks, of acquisition and engineering. Then we move them to an opportunity for operational experience in a first assignment so that they know what the Space Force does and why we do it. And we went back at the beginning of this interview and we said, what's the purpose of the Space Force? The first purpose of a Space Force is space control, to unlock the ability to do global operations from space that help support the entire Joint Force. And then as they're graduating out of their lieutenant years, we're going to allow them to select what they want to do in the Space Force and learn to specialize in. Back when I was in the Air Force, this was called OpEx inside acquisition. It was where an acquisition officer for their first assignment could go do an operational assignment and then go back to acquisition. I had 2 OpEx lieutenants work for me when I was in Korea in 2006, 2007. And they were so phenomenal, I tried to keep them. And I tried everything. I wrote a letter. I got my 06 to write a letter. Like these people are phenomenal. And the Air Force system said, heck no. All our acquisition officers are phenomenal. We let them go out, and it happens all the time that people try to steal them and keep them. And they went back to be very successful acquisition officers. So this, in my experience, is OpEx for all. It gives the OpEx experience for each one of these lieutenants who, if they decide that acquisition and engineering is what they want to do, they then have a foundation right there that they know what the Space Force does as well. I think that will empower them to be truly more successful when they become older and more mature as an officer. I'm pretty sure that General Gutlein, who's like the senior acquirer for the Golden Dome and also like one of the senior space, he was an OpExer. And then another good example is Phil Garan, who's the commander of SSC. I don't think he was an OpExer, but he's got like 3 deployments downrange and learning a lot about the why. And it's made them tremendously successful acquisition officers. So that's the general concept behind that. We want to make sure that people are afforded the opportunity to do the specialty they want to do. And I'll tell you why. It's been my experience that when people love what they do, they're really easy to lead. When they don't love what they do, you're constantly motivating and correcting. So giving them that choice, which is an informed choice, right, is better than locking people in when they're a sophomore in college and they don't even know what it is, because that was the other way.
Yeah, that's some fantastic context. There's never enough time. I always wish that we had more time to chat with these interviews. I probably wrote about like 2 times more questions than I'd have time to ask. So we're going to end it just on one. And it's a subject that I know you love to discuss. You recently discussed it at AFA. And that's the service's X-37B space plane. For our audience, how many missions has it been on now? What has the service learned? And I'm curious how it compares to similar assets adversaries like China have. I know there's some big developments there, but would love to end on that.
Yeah, so our U.S. Space Force space plane is on its 8th mission. It, as you know from its last mission, it conducted a highly maneuverable move in outer space called an aerobrake, which was the only one ever done in the history of humanity. Okay, like I'm bragging. Sorry, but that's pretty impressive. What we use that for is a series of tests and operational experiments that cover all Space Force mission areas. So we learn quite a bit from the use of our U.S. Space Force Boeing space plane. But I will tell you, that's not like the purview only of the United States. As you're highlighting, the Shenlong, which is the Chinese space plane, and they have a couple of those. I think Shenlong, going off the top of my head, I think it's on its 4th mission. And they are, conducting operations and experiments in outer space with that too. So we continue to watch that. We continue to watch that because we want to know what they plan to do or what they think they plan to do in 5 to 10 years. Because if I could bring it back to talking about competitive endurance and avoiding operational surprise, it's important to watch how people test. It's important to watch when their tests are successful and when they fail, because watching tests help you understand where they're headed, which is exactly why we've focused on OTTI in the service, because all our tests don't need to be in outer space. We want to be able to do them in live and virtual and constructed environments where we can fail and the adversary can't see it, where we can learn and the adversary can't see it, so that when we deliver a game-changing capability for the United States Space Force and really for the United States government, operational surprise isn't in DC, it's in Beijing.
General, fantastic insights. Thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. Again, there's never enough time to cover all the topics that we want to, so we'll have to pick it up at another date. So I appreciate it.
Hey, Tom, good luck with shoveling.
Thanks. I'm going to need it. I appreciate it.
All right, have a good day.
Next, we'll continue the conversation by examining how the United States is preparing to operate in a contested space environment.